Say the words out loud and they sound like a dare more than a plan. 50,000 planes in a year. When that target first entered public speech in 1940 and 1941, it didn't float in a vacuum. It landed in a world that counted airframes in the low thousands and measured production with the cautious cadence of peacetime procurement. 50,000 meant moving from artisanal speed to conveyor belt speed, from scattered workshops to synchronized continents. It meant turning a machine that could take months to hand-fit into something that moved in steps, jigs, fixtures, gauges, and shift whistles. And the number that dwarfed the dare 100,000 only makes sense when we understand what is being counted, how it is being counted, and why categories matter. Start with the simplest point. The goal was annual. It was not a promise to conjure a one-time pile of aircraft and be done. It was a run rate, a tempo, a drumbeat measured over 12 months of design freezes, tooling, vendor orders, raw material allocations, and trained hands. To say 50,000 per year is to say more than 4,000 per month, more than 900 per week, well over 100 per day, day after day, with holidays blurring into overtime and overtime hardening into normal. The scale is not just a number, it is a calendar, a clock, and a map of factories. What qualifies as an airplane in this count is the next foundation. The wartime ecosystem did not only build glamorous twin-tailed bombers and sleek, laminar flow fighters, it built transports that ferried men and material across oceans and over mountains. It built trainers thousands upon thousands, because a combat aircraft is only as useful as the pilot who can master it, and no nation can surge combat machines without first surging the schoolhouse. It built utility types that did the dirty, everyday chores: liaison, spotting, ferrying parts, and checking airfields. So when totals approach or exceed 6 figures in a peak year's flow, those totals include the full spread: fighters, bombers, transports, patrol planes, and trainers, all stamped and tested to an air arm's specifications, and all drawing from the same reservoirs of engines, aluminum, and labor. Counting methods matter because wartime counting is not tidy. Some ledgers record final assembly completions. Others record acceptances by the air arm the moment the machine is not just built but officially taken into service. Some tables list airframes by prime contractor. Others include license, produced variants under different corporate roofs. When you see a figure near 100,000 for a peak year's throughput, you are looking at a composite of these streams, and you must mentally separate two truths: the towering headline that captures the spirit of the surge, and the narrower, more technical lines that tell you which models, which roles, which acceptance dates. The temptation to throw everything into one boiling pot is strong. The discipline is to ladle carefully. All of this folds back into the mockery that lit the fuse. Dismissiveness has always been cheap, especially when it targets an industrial promise that has not yet hardened into steel and rivet lines. Scoffing at 50,000 made rhetorical sense to leaders who saw an America still shaking off the dust of the Depression, with factories underused, with labor skills unevenly matched to new aviation tolerances, and with a thicket of suppliers not yet reorganized for war speed. The jibe only bites, though, if the thing being mocked is a boast. The better read is different. It was a requirement framed as a number. It was a logistics equation translated into a headline. Air superiority and strategic reach are not free. They demand a feed of airframes and engines at a pace that beats attrition, expands training, and sustains offense. 50,000 was the arithmetic of staying in the air not just today but next season, and the D's the season after. This is why the later figure 100,000 matters so much. It is not simply twice the boast. It is the evidence that a whole society learned to count the right way. A production miracle is never just assembly. It is ore mined at one end and doctrine refined at the other. It is quantifying bottlenecks that never appear on posters, rolling mills that turn ingots into sheet at the right thickness, foundries that pour crankcases to the right weight and strength, machine tool builders that deliver the cutters and fixtures that give wings their repeatable ribs and spars. It is the teachable cadence of training, where you do not just build fighters but also the trainers to teach the fighter pilots who will live or die by what their hands learned under calm skies. And it is engine math, the sternest math of all, because without power plants you do not have airplanes, you have well-shaped furniture. So hold two pictures at once. In the first, the number glows like a neon promise above the skyline, 50,000. It shocks, provokes, and defines the scale of the problem. In the second, the number becomes a ledger line, boring in the best way, broken into daily acceptances, supply allocations, workforce headcounts, and shipping schedules. The jump to 6 figures in peak flow belongs to that second picture. It is what happens when the headline is converted into budgets, blueprints, procurement ratings, and railcar manifests. It is also what happens when factories learn that quality and speed are not enemies, if one learns to standardize tasks, freeze designs at the right moment, and respect the long lead times of jigs, dies, and gauges. There is another layer, quieter but essential. Counting the surge also counts the cost. Mass production is not a parade of shiny noses rolling into sunlight with confetti in the air. It is night shifts and burned coffee, bruised thumbs and aching backs. It is young workers learning old crafts at new speeds, and it is old workers retraining their hands to tolerances that never mattered before. It is communities swollen by migration and housing built in a rush, childcare improvised, buses rerouted, mess halls extended, clinics stretched. When the big totals land in the historical record, they can blur these human facts. But the truth of the number is that it is made of people, and the cadence of their days is as real a component as the aluminum. To understand why the mockery failed, imagine the difference between pointing at a mountain and saying, "Impossible," and laying out the switchbacks that climb it. The first requires breath, the second requires maps, teams, and food drops. 50,000 drew the line on the map. 100,000 proved the switchbacks were cut, the camps supplied, and the climbers trained to carry the weight. There are 1,000 ways to misunderstand a number this large. The right way begins with definitions, categories, counting rules, and the humility to accept that a miracle is only a miracle from far away. Up close, it is the sum of ordinary steps multiplied by time. The past is not a museum piece. It is a workshop manual written by people who had to solve their problems under pressure. The promise of 50,000 and the delivery of a flow that vaulted past 100,000 at peak should matter to any era that wants to be safe, prosperous, and free to choose. Today, the conversation about deterrence, resilience, and industrial strength often sounds vague, as if security were a feeling rather than a measurable capacity. This story drags the talk back to first principles. It shows that power in the modern world is timed, tooled, and taught. It is the total of what a society can build, move, fuel, and repair before the storm and during it. Think about lead times. Modern devices are more complex than the airframes of the 1,940 seconds, but the time constants rhyme. Engines still take longer than fuselages. Specialized materials still demand hard-to-scale inputs. Skilled labor still takes months to train and years to perfect. Forgings, castings, and the machine tools that shape them still anchor the pace of everything else. The lesson of the wartime ramp is not that anyone can snap their fingers and conjure output. It is that disciplined forecasting plus early, binding orders plus predictable schedules transform lofty goals into probable realities. The plan was not to improvise. The plan was to standardize until flow emerged. There is also a supply chain sobriety that begins here. In present debates about reshoring and friendshoring, about whether a nation can withstand a shock to shipping lanes or sudden scarcity in a key alloy or semiconductor node, this story stands like a mile marker. Aluminum in that earlier era did not fall from the sky. It was mined, smelted, rolled, and rationed. Energy fed the smelters, rail fed the rolling mills, priority systems fed the right factories in the right week. Modern, equivalents rare earth processing, high-purity chemicals, photolithography equipment, large composite layup and cure capacity call for the same choreography. Those who laugh at hard numbers because they sound inconvenient are the same as those who laughed then. Those who intend to meet numbers adjust their calendars, their checkbooks, and their tooling orders now, not later. Culture is often the hidden engine. What looks from afar like a steel cathedral is, up close, 1,000 decisions about how people learn and how they are trusted. During the surge, teenagers learned inspection work with gauges built for them to succeed. Women moved into roles long fenced off by custom. Migrants from farms and small towns and cities alike found themselves reading blueprints at benches, taking pride in tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. That broadening of who gets to build is a lesson as relevant now as it was then. If you want six-figure flows of complex systems, you widen the gate to talent and you teach the craft without snobbery. You don't wish productivity into existence. You mint it by helping new hands become old hands faster. Another reason this matters is strategic patience. Public debate today lives at the speed of posts and viral charts. Tooling does not. Machine tool builders live on timelines that laugh at the news cycle. The surge succeeded because procurement embraced this mismatch and protected the slow and essential from the fast and distracting. Design freezes were respected. Changes were batched rather than sprayed. Pilot lines taught lessons before grand lines made expensive mistakes. That discipline is not glamorous, but it is the difference between headlines and deliveries. When you hear a modern promise about capacity, whether in energy systems, digital infrastructure, health countermeasures, or defense, you can ask the same sober questions. When do the jigs arrive? Where are the gauges? Which vendors have firm orders and funded upgrades? Who is training the inspectors? There is also a moral clarity within this story that deserves space. Pure output is not an idol. It is a means to win air superiority faster and to shorten a war. It is the ability to escort bombers all the way to their targets and bring more crews home. It is the cushion that lets you rotate pilots from frontline sorties back to training squadrons to teach the next wave. It is the inventory that lets you ground a flawed type until a fix is proven instead of gambling lives because you cannot afford to stop. And it is the material proof to allies that you are not only talking about commitment, you are making it steel and aluminum and gasoline. In any present contest for credibility, that kind of proof still translates. Finally, consider the humility embedded in the big numbers. They were not achieved by genius slogans or by wishing away constraints. They were achieved by thick binders of schedules, by the kind of governance that knows who decides and who does, by a market of suppliers given both the money and the time to expand, and by a national mood that treated work as service. The headline is the easy part. The means are the hard part. That is why this story matters now. It replaces hazy ambition with a blueprint. If you can count your constraints and name your bottlenecks, if you can order your tools and teach your people, you can aim high without turning your aim into a joke. The laughter dies when the crates start to stack and the propellers start to bite the air. Before the dramatic goals, there was a quieter prelude. In 1938, the industry was a patchwork of companies with strong design cultures but modest volumes. Airframes were evolving quickly. Metal replaced fabric and wood. Engines pushed into higher horsepower. And doctrine was still undecided about the exact mix of bombers, fighters, and patrol planes needed for the next war. Europe's descent into conflict accelerated procurement ideas in many capitals, and orders began to rise from allies who were desperate to fill squadrons in a hurry. In those early months, export orders taught factories to think bigger. The lines lengthened, the vendor lists thickened. The first taste of scale arrived not as a domestic mobilization but as a response to overseas need. By late 1940, a phrase entered the language that reset expectations, an arsenal not as a metaphor but as a plan. The concept was simple and ruthless. Measure what the conflict would consume, measure what the training pipeline would require, and then build capacity not to meet last year's crisis, but to outrun next year's. That shift from chasing events to leading them is the pivot on which the whole story turns. It coincided with the public declaration of an annual goal that sounded impossible. While it shocked, Inside the factories, the reaction was less theatrical and more practical. Engineers froze designs in phases. Purchasing departments sent out unprecedented waves of orders. Machine tool makers expanded. And the first experiments with moving lines for large airframes began to move from sketches to floor space. In 1941, the math changed from urgent to existential. The attack that winter made the abstract very concrete. The calendar for expansion was no longer set by political patience but by necessity. Raw materials were rationed with care to the right programs. The workforce swelled, training schools multiplied, and procurement became a language everyone in the industrial ecosystem had to learn. The run-up year merged into a sprint. Factories that only months before felt oversized suddenly felt cramped. Designs that had seemed ambitious were now baseline. Supply chains that had been provincial suddenly became continental, and the railroads took on a second identity as arteries of war. In 1942, governance matured to match ambition. The aeronautical enterprise received not just slogans but an operating system. Priority ratings told mills, forges, and foundries which orders belonged at the head of the line. Cost plus contracting removed some of the fear of scaling by ensuring builders would not be punished for expanding capacity. Tooling got the respect it deserved. The staccato rhythm of early improvisation gave way to the steady drumbeat of scheduled flow. Pilot lines ran and stumbled and learned. Main lines formed and grew confident. In the same 12 months, the training pipeline found its stride, which mattered as much as any rivet count, because throughput in the air depends on throughput in the schoolhouse. In 1943, the ramp unquestionably became a surge. War maturity arrived in the thrum of shifts and the glare of lights over vast floors. The quiet heroes were gauges and fixtures that made repeatability a fact rather than a hope. Subassemblies from distant suppliers arrived and mated without drama because the drawings and tolerances finally lived in the same world. Engines, always the long pole in the tent, stabilized in flow and reliability as vendors conquered metallurgical and machining hurdles. Inspectors gained speed without losing rigor, and rework rates fell. Schedules stopped being prayers and started being predictions you could plan around. The language of shortage did not disappear, but it retreated. You could feel a system scattered and nervous only 2 years before becoming sure of itself. In 1944, the peak asserted itself. The front line's appetite for machines, spare parts, and replacements was greedy in the extreme, but for the first time supply did not feel like a constant cliff. Long-range escort fighters arrived in sufficient numbers to change operations. Heavy bombers, built in astounding quantities by multiple firms, lifted daily in formations that could only be described as industrial in their mass. Trainers still rolled because training never sleeps. Transports multiplied because the logistics of victory demanded air bridges across oceans, mountains, and jungles. The fabled year of near 6-figure flow in aircraft acceptance belongs here, a testament not to a single plant or a single model, but to a whole orchestra that finally played in tune. In 1945, the drawdown began before the final shots. The plan had always been to outrun need, not to match it exactly, and so inventories were full in some categories even as combat needs evolved. Design improvements still appeared, but the urgency to freeze and rush had softened. The governance that had commanded every ton of aluminum began to think about peacetime markets again. Orders tapered. Factories began to ask what they would be in a quieter world. Workers tallied years of missed holidays and made plans. The common story says the machine simply switched off. The truer story says it wound down in stages, carefully enough to avoid chaos, quickly enough to relieve strain, with gratitude where anger might have been. Across these 8 crowded years, the thread that holds the story is not a single genius, or a single plant, but the steady education of a country in the methods of scale. Each calendar turn taught a lesson. In the first phase, urgency without structure produced heroic effort and uneven results. In the middle, structure caught up, and effort was finally rewarded with consistency. At the peak, consistency delivered mass. In the end, mass gave way to restraint, because victory demands that as surely as it demands hunger. To walk through the timeline is to watch a society teaching itself to count, to plan, and to finish. If you want to know why laughter turned to silence and then, grudgingly, to respect, this is the answer. The dates are not a backdrop. They are the engine. Start with the total shape of the mountain. Over the full run of the war years, the count of American aircraft built reaches into the hundreds of thousands, and the portion accepted in the roaring middle of the conflict. Especially the year when flow approached, the six-figure mark is the summit of that climb. That picture changes slightly depending on whether you count by final assembly, by acceptance into service, or by contracts let and deliveries later tallied. What doesn't change is the fact that volume was not a marvel of a single month or even a single quarter. It was a sustained tempo that stretched over many quarters, a proof that planning beats panic, that boring discipline beats heroic improvisation once the learning curve is climbed. Zoom into a daily rhythm that hands over more than 100 completed machines on average is not just a story about final rivets. It is a story about how many wings must arrive from subassembly one day earlier, about how many engines must be tested and delivered 2 days earlier, about how many propellers must be certified and waiting 3 days earlier, about how many instruments must be calibrated and packed 4 days earlier. That cascade continues backward until you reach the smelter, the rolling mill, and the rail car. In other words, the fast fact you can hold is not only the headline number, but also the cascade of earlier thans that make a headline possible, which is why precise schedules and priority ratings were not bureaucratic frills, but the secret sauce. Consider categories. Fighters dominated headlines because they dueled and escorted. Heavy bombers drew awe because of their size and missions. Transports looked humble but fed a war's appetite for movement. Trainers were the quiet backbone. When totals that flirt with or cross 100,000 in a peak flow are quoted, it is because the trainers and transports are properly included alongside combat types. If you remove the trainers, the totals shrink and you lose sight of a simple truth. Without a flood of basic, advanced, and transition school aircraft, the line of combat machines would have outrun the line of pilots and crews. The wisdom of including all categories is not statistical padding, it is operational honesty. Engines set the pace. This is perhaps the most important fast fact in disguise. For every airframe there is a power plant or 2 or 4. For each power plant, there are superchargers, magnetos, fuel pumps, and precision parts that cannot be rushed by will. The bottleneck was often a foundry's ability to pour, heat treat, and machine alloys to endure heat and stress far beyond peacetime norms. When the schedule worked, it was because these invisible factories worked. If you imagine an assembly line pausing, do not picture riveters standing idle for lack of skins. Picture crew chiefs waiting for engines to arrive from a plant hundreds of miles away, where metallurgists and machinists wrestled with the laws of physics. The engine fact is not glamorous. It is decisive. Aluminum is the universal solvent of this story. The jump in smelting and rolling capacity underwrote everything that flew. Electrically hungry smelters pulled new power lines across landscapes that had never dreamt of such load. Rolling mills learned to defeat warping and buckling at volumes that would have sounded like fiction 3 years earlier. When you read a daily or weekly acceptance figure, you can write a smaller note beside it. Somewhere, a rolling line of sheet and plate ran to make that figure possible. Somewhere else, scrap returns were sorted and melted to feed the line again. The fast fact worth carving in stone is that materials are not a footnote to production, they are production by another name. Labor transformed the line into a nation. The headcount in key plants exploded, and the distribution of who did what changed. New hands learned metrology, the discipline of measuring precisely so that parts fit the first time in places they would never see. Experienced hands taught tacit knowledge that no manual could fully capture. How to feel a fit, how to listen to a motor, how to spot a flaw with a glance. Overtime became normal, and normal acquired rituals that held morale together. Cafeterias that actually fed, buses that actually ran, foremen who actually communicated. The exact numbers can vary from plant to plant, but the shape of the story is consistent. Swelling headcounts mapped to swelling output because training was scaled deliberately, not left to luck. Quality did not bow to speed. It learned to live with it. The received myth is that mass production inevitably means corner, cutting until the end user pays the price. The truer fast fact is more complicated and more hopeful. Inspection methods grew more rigorous, even as throughput climbed, because standardization allowed a single inspector to check more parts in less time without losing vigilance. Gauges replaced eyeballing. Go divided by no. Go blocks replaced arguments. Statistical sampling replaced hunches. Rejects and rework did not vanish, they never do. But they stopped sabotaging schedules because problems became predictable and fixable. The most important word in that sentence is predictable. Predictable makes planning possible. Planning makes mass possible. Transportation stitched the whole organism together. Trains carried engines, wings, fuselages, and propellers, with priority plaques that moved them past peacetime cargo without ceremony. Ports shifted to handle crates with special slings. Highways took on the role of last-mile arteries for oversized loads. The number that matters here is not a single daily figure, but a persistent ratio. How many rail cars? How many trucks? How many loading crews per airframe accepted? That ratio improved as the surge matured. The earlier chaos, a boxcar missing, a crate misplaced, a wing delayed for lack of a single fitting, gave way to a choreography that most citizens never saw and would not have found thrilling if they had. But it is the difference between a dream and a delivery. Money made the machine breathe. Contracting forms that paid for capacity and tooling ahead of deliveries changed the psychology of every builder and supplier. When a company believes the orders are firm and the cash to expand is real, it hires boldly, orders confidently, and endures the first months of inefficiency without panic. The fast fact is not merely budgets printed on paper, it is commitments that cascade down to the smallest vendor. A mill that knows it will be paid on time buys the new roll, trains the new operator, and volunteers for a night shift. Multiply that 1,000 times, and the headline numbers start to look less like a miracle and more like the product of sane policy. The last and perhaps most important fast fact is that all these facts live together or die together. You cannot have engines without materials and metrology, airframes without jigs and fixtures, quality without gauges, training without trainers, deliveries without rail priority, and a healthy vendor base without money that respects lead times. When people quote totals for that peak year and smile at the audacity of it, they are really smiling at a system that chose to be coherent. The mocker's laugh never survives contact with coherence. Numbers this large are not achieved by swagger. They are achieved by 1,000 modest truths kept, 1,000 modest deadlines met, and 1,000 modest skills taught until the extraordinary becomes ordinary. That is what the big totals say, if you listen carefully. A country learned to do ordinary things on an extraordinary scale. The story of mass production always grows a second skin of rumor. The bigger the number, the louder the claims that try to explain it away or turn it into magic. During the wartime surge, myths multiplied faster than the rivets. People said factories flipped a switch and ran at full speed on day one. They said a heavy bomber came off a moving line every hour from the start, like clockwork on a postcard. They said money alone bent physics, and that quality bowed to speed because speed was all that mattered. None of that is true, and the truth is better. Real progress came from method, patience, and the discipline to make change slow and learning fast. It came from tolerances written into metal, and from managers who respected the calendar more than the headline. It came from workers who did not inherit skills but were taught them, step by step, until judgment felt like instinct. The first myth dies if you spend 1 week on a pilot line. A city did not knit stockings on Monday and rivet wings with flawless cadence on Tuesday. Between those pictures lay months of trial runs where engineers learned which joints needed new jigs, which drill bits burned too fast, which gauges were missing, which inspections were too slow. and which tasks were too hard for new hands in their first month. A moving line does not forgive guessing. It punishes it. Every design change ripples backward through fixtures, sub-assembly racks, hoists, and work instructions. You do not outrun that ripple with encouragement. You outrun it with frozen drawings, with training that respects the order of operations, and with floor leaders who know when a single loose hole can halt 100 yards of progress. Another legend says the hour per bomber miracle was a permanent state. The hour existed, but it arrived late, after bruising debug and relentless rework. The clock did not tick until sub-assemblies arrived with the same holes in the same places, and inspectors stopped seeing surprises and started seeing patterns. The hour was earned by standardization, not luck. When people retell that figure, they should also tell the long months of practice and the earlier days when the line lurched, paused, and started again. The miracle was not that the line could move fast. The miracle was that it could move fast the same way, hour after hour, without losing its shape. The money myth survives because it flatters the easy answer. Yes, budgets grew like mountains, but checks cannot pour molten aluminum, cut precision gears, or teach a crew chief to hear a sick bearing. Money buys time and tools. It does not buy the wisdom to use them. A checkbook that ignores lead times is a wish. A checkbook tied to a schedule becomes a plan. The curve bent upward when finance paid for capacity before the first perfect unit appeared. When machine tool builders were funded to expand, and when small suppliers had contracts strong enough to borrow, hire, and train. Money mattered most when it arrived early enough to respect physics. Some stories paint the surge as a clean ascent with no bumps. The real line was jagged. There were weeks when scrap rates rose for reasons no one could name. There were months when a supplier of a small, humble part fell behind and threatened to choke a grand line. There were engines that left test stands humming in the morning and came back coughing at night. Admitting this does not dim the achievement. It explains it. The climb became smooth only when feedback loops were short, when inspectors could speak and be heard, and when the calendar allowed time to fix root causes rather than slap bandages on symptoms. Another rumor says quality bowed to speed. It did not. Quality learned to live with speed by changing who was asked to make decisions. Fixtures and gauges took the burden off eyes and hunches. New workers were not told to copy a veteran's judgment. They were handed tools that made good choices easy and bad choices hard. Go divided by no-go blocks replaced arguments. Statistical sampling replaced superstition. When something failed, the change that fixed it was written into the method, not left to the mood of the shift. That is how quality rose while throughput rose too. The trick was not to push harder but to make the system less sensitive to mistakes. One of the loudest myths grew from awe at a single famous plant. People said one roof could win a war. No roof can do that. Even the grandest floor is a mouth at the end of a river. The river is ore, engines, forgings, gaskets, paint, glass, instruments, fuel lines, seats, and the trained hands upstream. If the river starves, the mouth starves. The correct picture replaces the lonely cathedral with a map of a continent. Orders, rail priority, shared tooling, and license production turned scattered firms into one organism with many hearts. That is not legend, it is logistics. There is also the rumor that contractors were dragged to speed by force. Some were, and they sulked and stumbled. Many did not need to be dragged. They were proud, angry at waste, and tired of missing their own targets. They wanted to be the line that found a rhythm and kept it. Pride became fuel when alarms rang at night, and a superintendent had to choose whether to restart a stretch of line or tear it down and rebuild. If you walked the floor when a first-pass assembly finally fit without pry bars, you felt a joy that no memo could fake. That emotion is not noise in the story. It is the current that kept people steady when the job was bigger than anyone's first plan. The last myth is that once the decision was made, success was inevitable. It was not. In a darker world, a dozen small errors could have multiplied into a slow failure. The difference was not a twist of fate, but a culture that prized coherence. The schedule served as a metronome, not a cudgel. It kept tempo while the musicians refined their parts. The only magic in this story is the kind you can measure. Design, freezes honored, jigs delivered, gauges calibrated, inspections respected, change managed in batches, and shipments that left the dock when the calendar said they would. The fog of rumor will always cling to big numbers. The way to clear it is to show the work. When you show the work, the wonder does not shrink. It grows because it belongs to real people doing real things well. Large numbers tempt us to point to a single hand at the top of the pyramid and stop there, but a pyramid cannot move. What moved was a living network of decisions that reached from a cabinet desk to a bench vise. The shape of that network explains why the promise of 50,000 became a tempo, and why the flow later brushed 100,000 in the peak. At the center sat a system for priorities that every supplier could understand. Ratings told mills and machine shops which orders stood first in line. Contract types paid for capacity, not just the last shiny thing at the end of a quarter. Budgets stopped being fog and turned into tools when they matched the time it takes to design a jig, cut a die and train a hand. The magic was not command, the magic was clarity. Decision-makers set aims, but their power lived or died in the schedule. A leader could announce targets to the newspapers, but the plant manager needed to know which design would be frozen in which week, which change would be held for the next block, and which vendor would get a check before a bolt was turned. The spine of the surge was a calendar with names on it. That calendar wrote the music of training classes, tool, deliveries, and pilot line runs. When a change would snap a fixture, it waited. When a change added life or safety without wrecking flow, it moved. The map from intent to airframe was a chain of sane choices that protected time. Procurement mattered because it taught the market to believe. A small shop with a good mill cannot gamble on growth without a contract it can take to a bank. The surge taught those shops that signed orders would be honored and that a late part would be noticed, not ignored. It taught them that the buyer might lend a fixture or send a trainer if that saved a week. It taught them that prices were not a knife at the throat but a handshake that kept both sides honest. Once trust spread, vendors bid for more work they could actually deliver and pushed their own suppliers to rise with them. A single letterhead could not make that happen. 1,000 checks, on time, did. Governance worked when it refused to worship novelty. Innovation came, but not at the cost of blowing up the line every Tuesday. Designs matured in blocks. Improvements that fit the fixture moved fast. Improvements that did not were staged. And miracles were told to wait until training and tooling could catch them without breaking. That discipline is not romantic, yet it beat chaos every time. It did not make the machine slower. It made it predictable. Predictable allowed rail planners to time shipments, schoolhouses to time graduations, and squadrons to time conversions, without starving frontline operations. Another quiet victory was measurement. Auditors and inspectors did not hover to say no. They existed to make yes safe. Gauges that matched drawings cut arguments. Sampling plans found bad runs before bad runs found pilots. Repair loops shrank because defects were visible to the people who could fix them, and because those people were allowed to stop the line when stopping was cheaper than rework. Management let data talk without anger. If a lot failed, it failed on paper, and at the bench, not in a briefing slide. The reward for truth was time saved, and time saved became airplanes. People sometimes imagine that the best factories ran on fear. The truth is simpler. The best factories ran on time. Where signals were clear, tensions fell. Where schedules were real, overtime eased. Where crews were trained, quality climbed without shouting. Fear might make a person hurry for an hour. It cannot teach a newcomer to read a drawing or feel a fit. Teaching did that. The training pipeline grew to match the production pipeline because leaders treated instruction as production by another name. A percent of every hour was reserved for learning, and the payoff was a line that stayed smooth when old hands left or new designs arrived. Transport and storage choices reflected the same calm. Warehouses were built for the parts that truly needed them. Everything else moved in and out on a timetable that kept the floor light. Rail priority meant a car with engines did not wait behind a car with lumber. Drivers knew which gate, which dock, which foreman. This kind of boring detail is the breath of a surge and the guardrail that keeps a miracle from swerving into chaos. When a train was late, a buffer absorbed the shock. When a storm closed a pass, the schedule had room to bend. Flexibility came from planning, not from panic. The final reason this network worked is moral as well as technical. The people in it believed the goal was worth the strain. They believed their names, though seldom printed, mattered to the men who would fly the machines. That belief did not shorten lead times, but it made lead times bearable. It made the third shift feel like a service, and the seventh inspection like a promise. Systems without meaning break under load. Systems with meaning bend and return to shape. Governance gave shape, purpose gave resilience. That is why decisions in offices far from the floor still show up in the numbers. The choices were clean, the time was honored, the people were taught, and the work became possible. A farm field became a bomber pipeline, and the world stared. The sheer sight of it, a sea of glass, a mile of roof, a floor that could swallow a city block, invited slogans. But scale without sequence is only a photograph. What made the place matter was the order of its steps and the patience to debug them. The bomber at the heart of the line did not begin as a friend of moving production. It was complex, heavy, and full of parts that had grown up in an older world of benches and stands. The first months at the new site were not smooth. Joints did not meet. Tools wandered. Carriages lacked the right balance, and the line hesitated, like a singer searching for a key. The teams learned to listen. They learned that a fixture is a promise kept in steel, and that a promise must be exact. The early remedy was not more hands. It was better hands, guided by better tools. Subassemblies were broken down into pieces that could be built in parallel by crews who did not need to be masters on day one. Wings learned to travel across the floor as landscapes of ribs and spars, rather than as mystery objects that only a few veterans understood. Jig tables stood like altars where each part was pressed into shape by blocks and pins that did not tire. Measuring was taught as a craft. Holes learned to be where the drawings said they would be, not where a hurried drill wandered. Once the parts stopped arguing, the airplane stopped arguing. That was the moment the line began to breathe. Vendors far away learned the same lesson. A bomber eats engines and instruments faster than any single plant can make them. Contracts pulled in makers of carburetors, magnetos, turbos, pumps, and glass. Drawings were shared and refined. Out-of-tolerance runs came home as stories, not secrets, and the next boxes arrived closer to right. The river that fed the roof stopped flooding and started flowing. Trains brought parts on a schedule that matched the takt of the floor, and staging areas shrank because staging time shrank. You could walk one edge of the building and read the calendar in motion, crates that would reach final join in 2 days, in 1 day, in a few hours, and then the dance where fuselage, wing, tail, and gear finally married. Skeptics said a moving line could never respect the quirks of a large bomber. The answer was restraint. The line moved only as fast as the slowest honest job could bear. When a step demanded a pause, the pause was written into the method so that it happened the same way every time. When a step could be sped up by a small change upstream, that change was made upstream rather than punished downstream. High work was dropped to low work whenever gravity could become a friend. Tools were hung within reach in the order of use. Light fell where eyes lived. An hour saved in walking is often worth more than an hour saved in argument. The layout remembered that fact. The workforce changed as the rhythm steadied. New faces arrived, learned fixtures instead of folklore, and taught the next group without the pride that says only veterans can know. Inspectors moved from hunting to confirming. Rework shrank as causes were trapped at their source. The great fear that speed would bend quality until pilots paid for haste fell away when the data showed the opposite. Predictable assembly produced predictable performance. The first flight of each unit became more routine, not less impressive. Confidence replaced applause on the floor. There is no better sign of maturity than a cheer turning into a nod. Outside, the world kept count and repeated the hour as if it had been there since the first day. Inside, people remembered the months of grind. They remembered the shift where a wing station would not align, and the night a new gauge caught a flaw that had hidden in plain sight. They remembered how long it took to understand that a small change in a bracket could save 10 minutes, at 3 later stations. They remembered the first time freight arrived exactly when the calendar said it should. These quiet memories are the real measure of the plant. The hour mattered. The ability to hold the hour, day after day, mattered more. The line taught a final lesson about humility. No sight, however grand, exists alone. When weather stalled a train, buffers absorbed the shock. When an engine vendor fell behind, another took up slack. When a defect crossed the threshold, the answer was not to blame a stranger but to change a drawing, a tool, or a training note. The gift of the place was not just capacity, but coherence. It turned a complicated airplane into a long song with a steady beat. By the end, the bomber that once fought the method had learned to flow, and the field that was once a farm had learned to feed the sky. Speed looks simple from a distance. A fighter arcs across the sky and leaves a clean line in the mind. On the ground, it is anything but simple. The heart of the craft is a power plant under stress that peacetime never demanded. To build fighters at scale, engine math had to lead airframe ambition. When the ramp began, the long pole in the tent was not the skin or the spar. It was metallurgy, heat, and airflow inside a case that had to live when pushed hard and high. That truth decided the flow of the lines that produced the sleek machines people remember. If engines lagged, nothing else could sprint. Production learned to respect that order. Airframe teams froze designs in blocks so the fixture makers could stop chasing a moving target. Engine builders expanded slowly and honestly, adding machines, heat treat capacity, and test cells in a sequence that matched reality. A unit on paper became a unit on a stand, then a unit with hours on it, then a unit cleared to fly. Every fighter on a final line sat at the end of that chain. Propellers, superchargers, and induction systems learned the same discipline. Pieces that hate improvisation were not asked to perform tricks. They were asked to repeat a known song until the entire section could play in tune. Suppliers multiplied. Castings for cases and heads, forgings for crankshafts and rods, gears that would scream if ground 1,000th off, seals that would weep if cured wrong, all flowed through shops that until recently had made calm things for a calm world. Contracts paid for new tools and for the people to run them. Inspectors who once checked farm equipment learned to check for flight. The training pipeline did not stop at the factory door. It reached back into classrooms that taught reading drawings, using micrometers and trusting gauges. The fastest way to speed is to slow down long enough to teach. On the fighter lines, differences showed up in floor choreography. Bombers teach patience. Fighters reward swift, tight motion. Stations were smaller and closer. Tools were lighter and stricter. Crews moved with a rhythm that felt like quick steps. But those steps were written, not improvised. A wing panel mated because the holes existed, not because a clever hand could stretch them. A cowl closed because the engine dimensions were true, not because a fitter could bully it into shape. When the engine shop sent better hearts, the airframe shop found new space to improve everything wrapped around them. The two worlds rose together. Numbers found their voice as learning curves. Early units were expensive in time and money. Each block brought change that stuck. Scrap fell because causes were caught. Setups shrank because fixtures were refined. First pass yield climbed because the loud problems were solved and the soft ones were named. The graph bent, then bent again. Pride rose in quiet places. A foreman would point to a rack and say yesterday that rack held 4. Today it holds 6. Next month it will hold 8, and nobody will bleed for it. People began to trust the future because the method had earned their trust. Engines gave fighters their reach and their teeth, and engines demanded respect. Heat must be fed and tamed. Air must be forced and filtered. Oil must live where metal is fierce. Those facts dictated inspection plans and test schedules. A power plant that failed on the stand saved a life later. Nobody enjoyed a red tag, but nobody argued with one. The culture turned that anger into fuel for better runs. In the best shops, the loudest voice belonged to the gauge, and the most respected person was the one who could make a failure speak. A fix that taught the system was celebrated more than a lucky save. When scale finally felt normal, the sky changed. Escorts flew farther. Interceptions bit harder. Training squadrons stopped starving. Maintenance units received engines and parts that behaved the same from crate to crate, which meant crews could learn once and perform many times. The line's gift to the front was not only quantity, it was sameness where sameness mattered and change where change helped. Variants arrived in blocks, not in chaos. Updates were taught, not rumoured. The pilots did not need to know the dance of fixtures and gauges. They only needed to feel that the machine in their hands was honest. The end of the surge did not erase these lessons. They stayed in people and in towns. A worker who once feared a micrometer learned to trust it and later taught a nephew. A shop that once cut rough things learned to cut fine things and never forgot. A manager who had seen schedules respected could not pretend later that calendars were decorations. When people speak of fighters at scale, they often name the shapes and forget the engines. The truth runs the other way. Engines made the scale possible. Airframes learned to follow. The arc in the sky began in a furnace, in a gauge, in a hand that checked a surface neither the pilot nor the public would ever see. The beauty of speed is real. So is the beauty of the bench that made it. Every grand number hides a tangle of quiet limits. And the grand tour, hardest limits are the ones that never make posters. The surge in aircraft did not begin in a hangar. It began in mines, smelters, tool rooms and classrooms. It began wherever ore became ingot, wherever ingot became sheet, wherever sheet became a spar that would not twist when a pilot hauled the stick and asked a wing to live. The first constraint was materials, not ideas. Aluminum required power in quantities that rewrote maps, and new rolling mills that behaved like rivers rather than ponds. The learning was not flashy. It showed up as fewer ripples in plates, fewer waves in sheet, fewer surprises when a rib came to meet a spar. The math was simple to say and hard to do. 1,000 mistakes in private to prevent a single failure in public. The payoff was that a distant airfield came to trust metal it would never see in raw form. Metal that only revealed its quality by not failing when a flight shook it hard. Power fed more than smelters. It fed heat-treat ovens, plating baths, and welders who depended on steady arcs. It fed machine tool makers whose own products were the seed corn of the surge. Without lathes, mills, grinders and broaches built in huge quantities and kept in calibration, there is no flow. There is craft, brave and slow. Tool rooms, therefore, became the hidden heart of the enterprise. They made jigs that turned a novice's hands into the hands of a veteran, and gauges that turned arguments into short nods. If a part fit a jig and a gauge agreed, the floor did not need to debate. The part did not ask permission to belong, it belonged by design. This is how you multiply talent without counterfeiting it. You build tools that make good behavior easy, and then you let time do the rest. Engines made their own weather. Metallurgy could not be bullied, and heat treated the arrogant and the lazy with equal scorn. The foundries learned to pour clean, to heat soak long enough, to quench at the right moment with the right medium, and to machine in steps that honoured the grain of the metal rather than bruising it. Crankshafts that would sing at full throttle were not born of hurry. They were born of respect for processes that had to be repeated 1,000 times without drift. 1,000 times without drift is not poetry. It is obsession. It is weekly calibration and careful logs. It is a foreman who refuses to pretend that a shortcut is a method. It is a test cell that tells the truth, even when the truth is that a run looked good until it did not. Logistics had a different kind of stubbornness. Rails had to carry ore one way and finished things the other, day after day, while still feeding a civilian economy that could not stop breathing. Priority plaques solved part of the puzzle, but the deeper solution was choreography. A car that arrived at dawn had to be unloaded, checked, staged, and fed to a line that would be hungry again tomorrow. Weather, labor, and chance attacked this rhythm. The defense was buffers chosen with care, neither so thin that a storm would starve a line, nor so fat that a warehouse became a trap that hid problems. Schedules that looked rigid on paper were elastic enough to absorb a strike of lightning or a late switch in a yard, and yet firm enough to let a dock crew in another city plan its sleep. People were the constraint that could soar or stumble. Recruiting alone meant nothing if training failed, and training alone meant little if pride was allowed to rot into gatekeeping. Production grew when instruction became a living part of the day, not a one-time lecture. A new worker learned to read a drawing the way a pilot learns to read a horizon, first with effort, then with feel. Supervisors who could teach were worth more than supervisors who could shout. The constraint inside the human heart, fear of looking slow, fear of asking questions, was disarmed by a culture that expected questions and measured progress honestly. The math of dignity matters here. People who are trusted to learn will. People who are not will pretend, and pretense poisons schedules faster than any broken machine. Even money had constraints that were moral more than mathematical. Credit only helps when it arrives before a choice is forced. Paying for capacity in advance required faith that the wider plan would stay the course. That faith was earned by schedules that survived contact with reality. Vendors noticed when dates were changed as a last resort, not as a habit. They noticed when inspectors condemned a lot without humiliation, and when an engineer admitted a drawing needed a correction instead of hiding behind a file. Money is a vote for the future. Votes are cast freely when promises are kept precisely. Finally, doctrine was a constraint with a long shadow. The kinds of aircraft ordered and the timing of their revisions could amplify or strangle flow. Committees that waited for perfection would have starved squadrons. Committees that changed for fashion would have wrecked fixtures. The steady middle way, the one that batched change into digestible blocks and aligned training with introduction, was the only way to outrun the enemy while respecting the factory. That posture did not fall from the sky. That patience built strength the enemy never matched. It was learned, argued, tested, and then taught until it felt natural. Constraints did not disappear. They were named and then organized. That is the quiet victory that sits inside the loud totals. Numbers rise when the hidden limits are not denied but woven into the plan. The surge did not serve one flag alone. It touched docks where foreign markings waited on crates, and airfields where accents mixed under prop wash. The idea was simple and radical at once. Build more than you can personally fly because friends will fly the rest, and in return you learn faster than any nation can learn alone. That idea had teeth. It required schedules that respected convoys and weather on seas half a world away. It required toolkits and manuals written so clearly that a crew chief in snow or jungle could trust them at 2 a.m. It required humility about how machines would behave far from the factory, where dust, fuel, and field habits rewrote assumptions. Lend-Lease looked like logistics on paper and felt like a conversation on the ground. A fighter's carburetor that coughed at altitude in one climate whispered a lesson to an engineer who changed a vent or a seal and sent a new block of parts next quarter. A transport that proved its worth on jungle strips could persuade a planner to widen that family in the next contract. A bomber that suffered from a brittle fitting learned to live when a license-built batch introduced a heat treatment that proved kinder to the material without slowing the line. If a fix worked far away, it could work at home. If a failure appeared far away, it might be hiding at home. The loop closed not through speeches but through crates and notes that travel both directions. The politics of generosity can be raw, yet the practice of it on flight lines was mostly gentle. Crews taught one another. Sharing tricks manuals could not hold. explaining how to listen for a bearing or where to look for the first hint of a crack. Manuals improved because translators with wrenches in their hands insisted on short sentences and clear drawings. Packaging improved because a dropped box in sleet at night taught a lesson no committee could invent. The outward flow of crates and the inward flow of notes formed a loop that tightened each season. The result was not uniformity for its own sake, but a family resemblance across fleets that made maintenance sane and mishaps rarer. Engines and fuels found themselves at the center of many of these conversations. Not every partner had the same gasoline grade, the same filters, or the same field tools. Parts kits were revised to include what reality demanded, not what a catalogue imagined. The best shipments arrived with spares that matched the kind of wear the unit was likely to see in its climate and role, instead of a grab bag that satisfied only a checklist. This attention looked small in a ledger. It was large in a war. A machine that starts in heat or in cold because a gasket was chosen for that place is a life saved, a mission flown, and a pilot who will come back to teach next month's class. There were awkward fits, moments when the design and the doctrine of a partner disagreed. Some air arms wanted ruggedness over sleekness, some wanted range over climb, some had training pipelines that favored simpler types in larger numbers. The lesson was not to argue philosophy at the crate. The lesson was to match inventories to what crews could exploit and to move other types where they would shine. The surge had room for such sorting because capacity was real. Where scarcity rules, every mismatch becomes a scandal. Where abundance rules, a mismatch is a puzzle, quickly solved by a swap. The sea, lanes and sky bridges that carried this collaboration were themselves feats of planning. Pilots ferried aircraft along routes that stitched the world together, hopping across islands, hugging coasts, leaping over weather and mountain chains. Each path needed charts, radio beacons, fuel dumps, maintenance points, and rescue plans that respected odds. The fact that thousands of aircraft made those journeys safely is as much a victory of logistics as any output figure from a factory ledger. It speaks to a culture that honored small preparations so that large ambitions could live. When the returns came in, the broken parts were boxed with tags. The anecdotes, written in cramped handwriting, the factories learned to treat them as gold. A fix discovered under a harsh sun or in heavy winter could become a universal update. A snag that looked rare turned out to be common once you knew where to look, and eyes were trained by the stories of distant crews who could not afford polite euphemisms. This was a second kind of courage. Not the courage of attack, but the courage of maintenance. It is the courage to say a part failed, and to let that sentence travel without shame to the place where a drawing would change. To speak of allies is to speak of tempo. A shared tempo downrange created a shared tempo upstream. Contracts anticipated mixed inventories, delivered parts that fit across variants, and aligned block changes, so a partner receiving new machines in spring would not be punished by a summer update that orphaned their spares. The goal was not to freeze the world, but to time it. That timing spared lives and money, and it turned a slogan about solidarity into a daily practice of mutual reliability. In the end, the greatest compliment one nation could pay another was simple. Your crate arrived when you said it would, and it carried what you promised it would carry. The arithmetic of output only matters if it changes the sky. By the middle of the war, it did. The most obvious change was range. Escorts began to appear beside heavy bombers when they were needed, not as a wish but as presence. Raids that once bled because fighters could not stay the course became raids that struck hard and came home with more crews alive. That single fact bent the arc of the campaign. It did not end danger. It measured it. Crews pushed into missions with a different confidence, the kind that lets a pilot plan the last minute of a climb and the last mile home. Confidence is not arrogance. It is the quiet knowledge that the machine will do what the manual says, and that friends will be there when the gauges sink. Sorties multiplied because planning was based on maintenance that worked. A machine that behaves the same from crate to crate lets crews learn once and repeat well. The surge gave squadrons that gift. You can feel it in diaries that stop complaining about inconsistency and start describing tactics, in reports that move from lamenting missing parts to debating which formation best protects a vulnerable phase of a mission, in training syllabi that grow richer because instructors can count on having the same tools next month they had this month. Standardization did not make war easy. It made attention available for the hard things, because the easy things stayed easy. Strategic bombing's power rested not just on tons dropped, but on the certainty that those tons would continue to fall tomorrow. Predictable replacement and repair kept pressure steady. It turned campaigns from sporadic punches into continuous weight. At the same time, the pipeline fed the less glamorous but utterly essential roles: patrol, transport, rescue, liaison. Air bridges moved men and material in quantities that shocked old hands on the docks. Small aircraft carried messages, officers, maps, and mercy to places that would otherwise have stayed silent. The sky became a lattice of purpose, not a gallery of spectacle. Outcomes invite pride, but honesty demands a ledger with a second column. The cost was heavy. Factories ate lives in slower ways than fronts did, but they ate them still. Fatigue was real. Injuries happened. Families bent around shifts that never aligned with school or church or sleep. Towns swelled so fast that sanitation and housing chased need and sometimes lost. The surge did not pretend otherwise. It met these costs with clinics, canteens, buses, recreation halls, and a culture that tried, within war's limits, to act like a neighbor rather than a landlord. This did not erase sorrow. It made endurance possible. There is also the cost of opportunity. When one sector grows like a forest after rain, others wait in shade. Peacetime projects were delayed, civilian goods thinned. People learned to do more with less and to fix what broke because new things would not arrive. The wartime machine borrowed against the future, and when the war ended, the bill came due in layoffs, shuttered lines, and skills that suddenly felt homeless. The reconciliation was not perfect. Some places adapted with grace, turning wartime experience into peacetime craft. Others needed help that came late or clumsily. The bruise faded, but the memory stayed. Measured in lives saved, the air superiority bought by scale is not theoretical. Escorts that arrived in time are counts of fathers and sons and friends who came home. Transports that beat weather are counts of patients who reached surgeons. Trainers that wore out under new hands are counts of rookies who became veterans without dying for lack of practice. Maintenance that had the right gasket in the right crate is a count of missions launched rather than scrubbed, of rescues flown rather than postponed. These are numbers too, though they never appear in glossy charts. They live in letters and in empty chairs that never had to be empty. Another outcome hides in hearts. Competence changes people. Workers who once doubted their own hands learned to master instruments and tasks that had seemed foreign. Foremen learned to listen because listening saved time. Engineers learned to see the floor as a partner rather than a stage. Pilots learned to trust ground crews with their lives because ground crews earned that trust each sunrise. Trust flows back into families and towns. It creates a memory that outlives the war and insists, quietly, that a community which once did hard things can do them again without waiting for a catastrophe to grant permission. Finally, outcomes live in doctrine. The success of escorts at range rewrote training plans and procurement plans. The success of transports rewrote ideas about supply, showing that air could knit theatres in ways rail and sea could not match when time dictated. The success of standardized blocks of change taught designers that elegance without maintainability is vanity. The costs rewrote doctrine too. Casualty lists forced hard thinking about tactics that were brave and wrong. Post-war debates were honest because the ledgers were honest. When a society records both its triumphs and its tolls, it inherits wisdom instead of slogans. The ledger closes with a paradox. The surge proved that a free society could discipline itself long enough to act like a machine without becoming one. It showed that schedules and gauges, if used with respect, are instruments of care as well as of command. It showed that output is not an idol, but a way to shorten danger and lengthen life. What it brought in the air was more than victory. It was time for people to live who would otherwise have died. Time for a world to breathe again, and time for the hard work of peace to begin. The last lesson of any great surge is not a song about the past. It is a checklist for the future, written in the grammar of time, tools, and trust. People often ask whether the mountain can be climbed again, whether six-figure flows of complex machines can return in a world of software and brittle supply chains. The honest answer is that the number is the wrong question. The right question is whether the mechanisms can be rebuilt with the materials of our century. The answer is yes, if the calendar is treated as the first tool rather than the last excuse. The first truth is lead time. You must pay the bill of long processes before you feel their benefits. If you need machine tools, order them yesterday and expect builders to need the same courtesy from their own vendors. If you need power, build it now and plan for the heat of furnaces, the draw of ovens, the throb of test cells. If you need skilled hands, start schools that respect craft and measure progress in days on task, not hours of slides. Someone will say this is slow. The answer is that slow is the speed of roots. Fast grows from it. The second truth is standardization with humility. Freeze designs in blocks, not forever. Change on a timetable, not a whim. When a fix is proven, spread it fast and clean. When a bright idea is not yet a fix, protect the line from to it until tests make it safe. This is not an enemy of innovation. It is its only friend when stakes are high. The earlier surge did not arrive by chance. It arrived because people protected the cadence of work while allowing wisdom to enter in measured steps. If you want to move fast later, protect consistency now. The third truth is engines. By whatever name engines now go. In one era it was a hot heart of metal with pistons and rods. In another it may be a battery pack, a turbine, a rocket chamber, a reactor, or a processor. The name does not matter. The logic persists. The hardest component sets the pace for the whole system. Protect that component with orders, with test capacity, with vendors who are paid to tell the truth when they fall behind. Align your wider system to that pace. Nothing wastes a year like building many shells for a heart that has not arrived. The fourth truth is that allies make you smarter. Share designs and parts so feedback finds you, and listen when it arrives. Write manuals for people who work with their hands in other languages and climates, and believe the reports that say your elegant solution fails on a muddy field at night. Welcome. Fixes that were born far away, and return the favor by sending your own back. This is not charity. It is self-interest with grace. The earlier surge grew taller because it grew wider. The next one will do the same, if pride can kneel long enough to learn. The fifth truth is moral. You cannot run people hot forever. Duty and overtime can climb for a season. They cannot be your business model. A plan that expects endless strain will collapse just when you need it most. Give workers rest, safety, clinics, buses, childcare. Give them training that can feed a peacetime life later, so their service now is also an investment in their future. The earlier story holds on this point with a fierce gentleness. Capacity is a human word before it is an industrial one. If these truths are honored, the number will take care of itself. The shape of the output graph will not be identical, because the world's needs are new and the machines are different. But the rhythm, the slow rise of competence, the stabilization of schedules, the quiet conversion of feedback into method will look familiar to anyone who has read this far with an engineer's patience. What cannot be faked is coherence. You cannot bully a fixture into existing. You cannot flatter a foundry into pouring. You cannot shame a schedule into keeping itself. You can only order early, teach well, test often, and let reality correct you before reality punishes you. Skeptics will ask for proof that such a culture can exist outside the heat of war. The answer is that fragments of it exist wherever real things are made without drama. They live in pharmaceutical plants that respect validation, in chip fabs that treat contamination as a mortal foe, in shipyards that stage blocks with procedure, in rocket shops that static fire until a plant's chamber sings, and in wind and battery lines that climb learning curves one notch at a time. These places are not loud. They do not advertise. They simply deliver, again and again, because they love the calendar and the gauge. There is a humility at the end of the path. The earlier generation did not think of themselves as wizards. They thought of themselves as stewards of time. They made sure that a tool arrived before a job, that a drawing could be read by a kid from 3 towns over, that a fix became a method instead of a rumor. Stewardship is not glamorous, but it is the only word that fits. If your aim is to build at scale with honor, then you are applying for the role they held. You will fail sometimes, then learn and try again. You will teach someone new what someone once taught you, and you will be proud when their hands surpass yours. So the last lesson is not about airplanes at all. It is about attention. The world runs on it. Mass production that preserves dignity is attention paid to the right steps in the right order for a long time. If you can gather that attention and protect it from noise, if you can teach it to apprentices and welcome it from allies, if you can turn it into gauges and fixtures and schedules that survive heat and boredom, then whatever your century needs, wings, chips, batteries, reactors, you can give it. And you can give it at a pace that turns mockery into silence.